I'm Àngels Natal-Asensio and I teach Spanish at Oakton High School in Vienna, Virginia. How can we encourage world languages learners to be more creative in their writing and speaking? Let's use Artful thinking routines. This is Project Zero's Artful Thinking palette. The palette shows the 6 thinking dispositions targeted by the thinking routines listed below each disposition. We're going to see a thinking routine that encourages the dispositions of observing closely and describing. Our thinking routine is called Nouns, Adjectives, and Verbs. In this routine, we ask students to look closely at an image, a work of art, or an object and record their observations using 5 nouns, 5 adjectives, and 5 verbs. I will show you an example of how I implemented this routine in my Spanish 3 class, using a set of images taken from a music video. Students can use a graphic organizer to write down their words. However, Post-its or colored note cards will allow students to manipulate their words in an easier way later in the culminating activity after this routine. Have these materials ready for the routine beforehand. As I explain the routine, I encourage you to follow along by doing it too. Let's get started. Start by showing your learners the images you chose and ask them to look at them closely in silence for a minute. Guide them in their observations. Have them look at the foreground of each image, the background. Tell them to let their eyes wander, paying attention to all the details. Ask them to write down 5 nouns, 1 on each of the yellow sticky notes to record their observations. Remind them that nouns are people, places, and things. Have your students share their nouns with a shoulder partner or a small group. Ask some students to share their nouns with the class. Now let's go back to carefully observe the pictures in silence. Ask your students to write down 5 different adjectives to describe the nouns they listed, or just write 5 describing words. Have them write 1 adjective on each of their blue sticky notes. Guide your students by asking them, what adjectives can you use to describe the people, the places, and the things that you notice and see in the pictures? Or imagine that you're one of the people in the images. How do you feel? Which adjectives would you use to describe your feelings? Have students share their adjectives with a shoulder partner or a small group. Then, have them share some of their adjectives with the class. In the third part of the thinking routine, look at the images carefully for a third time, also in silence. Then ask your students to write down 5 different verbs or action words, 1 for each of their pink sticky notes. For example, dancing. Once again, you may have your students share their verbs with their shoulder partner or a small group, and later on with the class. At this point, you may want to share some information about the images with your students. Or if you're using a work of art, you may want to tell your students about the work of art, its history, and its artist. You can also choose to share just some bits of information or to not share any of it. In this case, I decided that I didn't want to share any information with my students. I was going to ask them to use their creativity and imagination in the next part of the lesson, and I didn't want to give them any ideas that would inhibit these. What can language learners do with their lists of nouns, adjectives, and verbs while also using their creative skills? Working in pairs or small groups, for example groups of 4, I ask my students to share their inventories of words and combine those words to create a story based on the images they'd observed. Students shared the Google Doc to put their ideas together, discuss them, and combine and recombine their words to create their stories. I created a slide deck and assigned a slide to each group for them to copy and paste their stories and finally illustrate them. At the end of the lesson, each group presented their story to the class in an oral presentation. Not only does this thinking routine encourage language learners to observe and describe, it also helps them to categorize and to interpret what they see in the images. By asking them to share and combine their words to write a story, we are leading our students into collaboration to extend their ideas and use their imagination and creativity. These are some tips for using this routine in the World Languages class. Select images with lots of details and actions that trigger the vocabulary you would like your students to use and practice. Adapt the routine to your students' needs. You don't need to ask them for 5 adjectives, 5 nouns, and 5 verbs. You can ask for 2 or 3 depending on the language level and abilities of your students. Guide your students to observe the images closely, look at all the details, and record their observations. Remind them of what is a noun, what is an adjective, and what is a verb. Have your students use their inventories of words to collaboratively engage in a piece of creative writing, a story, a poem, a description, even a dialogue or a skit. This is an opportunity for language learners to manipulate the target language and see how different parts of speech work together. Adapt this task to your students' needs. Intermediate and advanced language learners can write more complex stories and descriptions. Novice language learners can write a short poem or a haiku, combining their words or even selecting some of them. I hope you enjoyed this thinking routine and consider using it in your class. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and if you'd like to see more examples of my work using thinking routines, follow me on Twitter. Thank you.